Amanda, good morning. How are you?
Fine, John. Good morning. Good morning.
Nice to see you. Our second podcast. I very much enjoyed the first one. How's the last month been for you?
Oh, it's been incredibly busy. A few ups, a few downs, but we're getting towards the end of the year now. So it's a very reflective time for me, actually.
Which is good because of this topic, which we'll come to in a second. Yeah, also a busy time for me for the firm. I've done, I think, my sixth injunction in the last week of 2025, which I think is a record in my community. So time to reflect and move forward into 2026. What we're going to talk about now are appraisals, and your title is Appraisals Myth, Mess, or Must Have. And the reason why we're doing it now is, I think, for two reasons. One is this is one of the times of the year, particularly in the City of London, elsewhere, where people are appraising. And it is one of the things that people most have to do in early to mid-December.
Yes.
And the other reason is, of course, you've got an incredible range of experience in this particular area, having run big HR departments over a number of years. So talk to me about what you want to talk about this morning.
I think, look, timing is perfect, but I think the process and the context around appraisals is not always perfect, John. And I think, the year-end performance review still holds such anxiety for people. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I'd like to talk about, a year-end appraisal versus continuous feedback. And then also solutions, how to make this process more enjoyable, more beneficial and balanced, and actually something that is going to drive better performance and continuous learning. So I think those are the three areas I think we could really touch upon. And of course, I mean, throughout, we're going to talk about when appraisals go wrong and how that also hinders development as well. So we've got lots to discuss on this one.
We do have lots to discuss, and I think we sometimes see it, you and I, from different businesses' perspectives, that you've tended to work in some very, very big multinational businesses. A lot of my clients will be medium-sized businesses who will be conducting less than perfect appraisal systems, sometimes not at all. And I think we'll discuss whether, to what extent, because I think there is a pushback now as to whether appraisals are even necessary. Are they, an aspect of, are they superfluous? Are they part of a really malicious woke agenda? Should we just junk them all? I think we should talk about that, because there are some managers who think that they are a complete waste of time. I'm interested in maybe 5 minutes time in talking about how to make appraisals a little bit better, because I've seen some horrendously labyrinthine appraisal processes, incredibly lengthy, and sometimes that can be a disincentive to conducting appraisals effectively, because if ever you are trying to make a process too complicated, it results in disengagement, and that's not really a good idea for anyone. So tell me, your counsel of perfection, you've got a few minutes now. How should UK PLC conduct a good appraisal system?
Yeah, well, okay. So I think we should take one step back though first, John, and think about why do appraisals trigger so much dread in perhaps both the manager and the employee.
Yeah.
And so there is this clear anxiety about this judgment day, which happens once a year. So what's behind that? So I think it's very clear that the stakes are high when it comes to the appraisal. It's often linked to performance, which is often then linked to compensation. And I think that's what creates this very high octane moment in the year of the employee. So those pay linked appraisals really create that kind of high response threat. I think secondly, there is always going to be a slight power imbalance. You've got a manager on one side who is giving a view on the optics across the year, but of course creeps in recency bias and other different biases, which we can talk about in a minute. And I think then you've got the employee on the other side who is battled all year, perhaps hasn't had on the spot feedback or regular meetings, one-to-ones with their line manager. And suddenly you get this bolt of information and feedback, which can be quite triggering for people. And I think the other thing is that there has been good research to show when feedback is delayed, it really loses credibility and
Yeah, that's true.
increases defensiveness. So it's so important to give on-the-job feedback, no matter what level you are as you go. So I think those are some of the reasons. We also know that your appraisal with your line manager is only as good as how strong the line manager is at giving feedback and actually preparing. And I'll tell you a small story. In my first investment bank, where I kind of grew up as such, there was such a strong feedback culture, John. You could do a presentation in front of a room full of people, and before you got back to your desk, you would have at least 3 people, maybe 4, who would have given you a 3+3- on how you did on that in that presentation. Nothing to do with appraisal. So there is this that certain organizations really believe that feedback is king, and it's something that needs to be given on a regular basis. So when you have that kind of environment, there's a much better acceptance and let's say
And you enjoyed that. You thought that was a good thing that people were giving.
100%. And it also makes the line managers much more used to giving feedback as well.
Yeah.
There's not this awkwardness. So there's this feeling of, they're coming from tangents and it's very, very consistent because you've continually given feedback on certain topics. So that's the first thing I think. You need that kind of feedback culture.
And if I could just say something, I mean, I agree with that. I think there's an element to which there's no such thing as bad feedback, but I think you have to give it consistently. I do think sometimes the English workplaces are not great at either giving A, feedback, or B, praise. And I've worked a lot with American businesses, and they can be really tough. They can be really ruthless. But one view of mine, it's not evidentially based, but one reason why an argument that America is a more successful, at least a richer country in performance terms, is that they're better at giving direct feedback in terms of performance. They're more intolerant of bad performance, but they're better about praising good performance, which is motivational. And so I'm not sure to what extent British workplaces are great at praising positive contributions.
Yeah. I've mostly been in international organizations, but I can absolutely see that being a nuance. But I also think feedback cannot be this stayed once a year process, which is what a lot of organizations still rely on. However, I think a lot of organizations have also evolved from there. They do now have a mid-year. They often have a monthly feedback discussions or at least check-ins, which can be a very good vehicle for already starting to set feedback loops into the relationship. So I think that's really important. And we know that humans need those ongoing feedback loops because they can be very positive and they also can be developmental. And that's to that point of the difference in culture. And I think for me, where it's extremely important is there is well documented evidence to show that there is a very strong bias called recency bias. I've mentioned it already, but this is something that comes at end of year. The managers there having to do probably 12 to 15 appraisals for their team, and they're thinking of how do I think about that individual, and they're only thinking about things that have happened in that last quarter, potentially even the last month. Here, this is where the training, the line manager training, and the expectation of what the full year has looked like for the individual, and that's why it's really helped by having a mid-year. I have definitely had cases in my career where you have a employee comes to you, feels that their appraisal is unfair. And we look at the mid-year, or we look at even the interim ongoing catch-ups, and you see that there is a misalignment with the messages that were given. So that's why it's quite important to have it from an audit trail, but also from a comprehension perspective to understand the full range of performance of that individual.
I agree with that. I mean, we moved about 2 years ago to quarterly reviews or check-ins from an annual review, and it's much better because the meetings plural become much less loaded, to your point. And I would encourage people, if they're working in an organization, they don't have a quarterly check-in, it's not a full appraisal, is really, really important, because then you can discuss what's going on for the month ahead, and there might be a couple of months performance. And then you have a meeting, and then everything is relatively recent. You're not trying to remember something that might have happened 10 or 11 months ago. And the employee, if they've got something that they want to get off their chest, they can get it off then. They can say, as once or twice, people have said to me, John, I think you're unfair. When you gave me that, when you gave me that feedback, I think you were slightly mean there. And I said, well, look, but that's fine. But they can evidence a piece of work that was done for a client in the last 2 or 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
right that we talk about that, and that resentment is then not building up. I mean, if they've done a good job, I tend to praise quite regularly as well. I'm not mean all the time, but these regular checkups and that they're then, noted down and just filed somewhere, that's really, really important, because you're creating an environment for them to have their say, and you're saying to them, I value you. This is your meeting. You're going to do most of the speaking, and I'm going to listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, that's lovely. And don't forget, I mean, at the end of the day, to increase performance, you have to have that developmental edge. And for me, it's very clear. If feedback only happens once a year, it's not feedback, it's judgment. So it has to be continual. And, there was a report by Gallup last year, I think it was between 2023 and 2024, that showed the performance appraisal is one of the most stressful employee events experienced across the year. So we
Right.
can absolutely understand why. But secondly, Gallup also said that employees that receive meaningful feedback are significantly more engaged than those who only receive feedback once a year. So there's evidence, real evidence to show that.
I think that's right. I mean, and the stats I've seen, I think it's still the case that more people leave their jobs because of their boss, their relationship with their boss, than issues of pay. And so if you can resolve that, so more people leave work because of cultural issues than because of pay issues. And still
Yes.
less because of the substance. I don't find my job interesting. I'm not interested in the substantive content of my job. Very few people leave their jobs for those reasons. It's these personality reasons that
One,
people are
yeah.
leaving their jobs, and the cost to an organization of that person leaving, then they're on notice, then the cost of replacing that man or woman. You have to go 9 times out of 10 to a recruitment agency. You're having to pay 20-25% of their wages. The loss of management time and engaging with the recruitment process is huge,
Yeah.
all for perhaps better, more regular performance management.
Exactly. And now let's talk about the generational aspects of this as well. I mean, younger generations, so millennials and Gen Zs, Deloitte said that they actually really prefer ongoing feedback as opposed to something bottled up at year end. So we've also got to think about the different aspects of the workplace. And I think, poorly trained managers, sorry, excuse me, I'll get my teeth back in. Poorly trained managers can turn continuous feedback into micromanagement. So again, it is important to have ongoing feedback, but you want to make sure the manager is trained on how to give feedback. And that's something that often doesn't happen. But in big companies, you have the time and resources to be able to skill managers to be able to give balanced feedback,
I think that's very good. And I have never actually seen that in mid-level workplaces that are often, the majority of employees in this country, HR people might be listening to this, are employed in businesses that employ between 25 and 100 people. And I
Yeah.
bet you that virtually none of the managers giving appraisals have been trained in those workplaces in how to conduct appraisals. So I think that's a really good takeaway that you got. But I want to ask you this. I've been involved in really lengthy labyrinthine appraisal processes that become incredibly time consuming and frankly incredibly boring and attritional. How does one deal with that? How do we get away with that and make appraisal processes more empowering and frankly shorter?
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, I think we talked about this some time ago that, there is now this much more focus on doing something project based, because so many jobs are now project based or mandate driven, as opposed to something that's just ongoing. And for those organizations that have, elaborate processes, I think there is a definite recognition that the amount of effort required, in addition to a 360, for instance, which often is, goes in balance with a year-end appraisal, can be a huge amount of work. So what I've seen recently is the 180 or 360. So this is feedback from peer groups, managers, employees upwards to the individual. Are becoming far more evidence-based driven. They shouldn't always be used for performance. They should be much more used for development. But that has data points which can be added into the year-end appraisal. And I think that is if you do the mid-year conversation around the 360, I think that really creates a very nice midpoint in the year to give that feedback. But let me tell you, I have worked in different banks, US banks, French banks, and of course German organizations, and they all have very different perspectives on this. Some are very heavy processes, which include feedback from peers, even in the year-end appraisal. Some are just very much manager and employee. But one thing I've done as an HR professional, even for my own team, is that I always get feedback from peers and at least their directs, because I think the onus is on the manager to do the work here. I'm afraid. I'm sorry, and I think you can obviously be very clear that it's all of the colleagues of that individual, because it's important to get that feedback. And I will give often anonymized comments that have come from those conversations to the individual. And I have found the most growth when you can provide both factual feedback based on your perspective and your insights, and in addition to that peer collaborative feedback as well.
And can I ask, for those who perhaps who are listening who don't have this, if one was conducting a peer review, 360-degree appraisals, how many, what's the demographic there? How many people are you getting feedback from? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 15? What's the average?
Yeah, it's usually 5 to 8.
5 to 8.
Yeah, but best thing.
And different levels within the organisation.
Yeah, different levels. Maybe a couple of employees, a couple of peers, in different business lines that you have connection with, and of course your manager. So. But of course, with all of these things, and having been in an American investment bank where this is sacrosanct, it happens every year, it gets unwieldy. It's then eventually hundreds of people being asked to do these reviews. So if you can make the review more quantitative, so rating of individuals, rather than always qualitative feedback, you can do quite a lot with those data that comes out of it, and you can use that to obviously benchmark year on year. So those are the kinds of things that you can
And
do.
the feedback isn't anonymous, those 5 to 8, they're giving
Yes.
anonymous. It should be anonymous. Okay.
Yes. Now here's an interesting thing, John. In one organization I was at, and I think this is best in class, frankly, there was a automated 360 process where you send it out to the reviewers. By the way, the manager approves the list of reviewers the employee is asking, so it's not mates on mates. It's very much a fair.
Ask that.
So there's a first check in there with the line manager and the employee. Yep, this looks like a great list. It's fair. And obviously you want, varied feedback. And then the second thing is, when the report comes, there's a few things that should happen. There should be a conversation for the employee to have with a HR person or a coach who can talk them through that, because often I've seen it so many times where employees will go straight to the areas of development. They'll even bypass the strengths to go to this because that's the bit that is meaningful for them. So there is a need to get the feedback. That's the first thing. So if we can help individuals understand and draw them into actually some of the more developmental points that are positive, I think that can really help as well balance things. But the key thing here is the following. The manager of the employee should get a report which does show who the attributable comments are from. Because what is supposed to happen is that the individual, the employee, should take that appraisal, that feedback report, and go to each of the reviewers and say, look, this is my feedback report. I don't know who said what. I would love to hear in real time what you're thinking, because that's what the actual report should be, a catalyst for a further deeper conversation. Now, that doesn't happen in all organizations.
No, very rare in my experience.
But that is exactly what feedback is supposed to be. It's a two-way process. And I always advise leaders who are filling in these kind of reports, do not write anything you cannot say to somebody's face. And I've always believed that's a kind of like a line of truth that I've always tried to ensure that people understand, because this is really triggering stuff when you get that report landing on your desk and you're like, oh God, this is what everybody thinks.
It's very important, because other than our immediate family members, we're spending more time with our peers, our work peers, than anyone else, sometimes including, often in my case, my family members. So I just think, so if you're getting bad feedback there, then or difficult feedback, it's one's reactions are often emotional and challenging and difficult, because it really matters how you are spending 8 to 10 hours a day. Really matters. But I like that idea. I want to come to the consequence of not doing an appraisal in a minute. But I like that idea about appraisals being forward-looking as well as backward-looking, and that's
Yeah.
something we spoke about before coming on this podcast. So tell me a bit about that, because generally I have thought that I have perhaps rather crudely thought, well, appraisals are a kind of rear view mirror view of the world. You're just looking backwards, but actually you're saying they should perhaps be 50% backwards, but also 50% forwards. Here's what you and I potentially need to do better.
There's three main sections for me. There's, of course, your objectives, which you've set up at the beginning of the year. Then there is the mid-year check. But if we talk about the year-end appraisal itself, how have people done against those objectives? This is now where you bring in your 360 feedback that you hopefully have done earlier in the year, or your kind of regular check-ins, and a more holistic conversation now, which is forward-looking, which is, okay, this is how I think you've done this year. These are things I think you've done really well. These are things I think we need to improve on. Here is an action plan. We're going to think about that. And now let's talk about where you see yourself in the next year. Where are you aiming for? Where can I help direct and guide you? So there should be that really holistic conversation. So it isn't just about judgment of how the last couple of months has gone. John, I think, there's no perfect appraisal system. And even then, you have to have well-trained and grounded, let's say, line managers who can manage those very difficult conversations sometimes. But we know that there are so many biases here. We've talked about recency bias. There's affinity bias. There's this halo and horn effect. And then, of course, let's even more when we think about from an employment forces perspective, gender and racial bias. That has been shown that there are elements of that can creep into once-a-year processes that are done with just a line manager and an employee. McKinsey, in their latest Women in the Workplace report, showed that women and minority employees are more likely to receive vague, personality, let's say, based feedback rather than actionable advice. And I've dug down on that myself as an HR professional when I've had employees come to me to really understand what's going on. And often you go back to the line manager and the line manager will say, yeah, I didn't want to touch that topic. The person might cry because, of course, women cry. No one else does. And there's that. And then there's also, I wasn't sure how that would land. So, I'm a bit worried. And again, this comes from nervousness around giving feedback and not being clear and factual in what you're trying to convey. And that's when people have doubt. So then often the female employees leaving potentially that meeting and really confused. You're doing really well, but actually your rating is quite low. I've had that so many times. So I think this is where the investment into leadership, and its leadership generally, has to be done by the organization.
I think that's right. I want to say two things. I mean, just a plug for ourselves. We have a one-page appraisal form. Okay, so for medium-sized employers, you have deliberately, when I inherited a team from a business that we bought, they had a really detailed appraisal form. It was boring and it took too long to complete. The best appraisal form I ever saw for a small and medium-sized organizations was from a management consultancy client of mine. I can name check them because they were bought, so they no longer exist, called Trinity Horn. They had a one-page form, which was their brand values. And they used the appraisal to reinforce the brand values of their organization and to score and assess their employees against those brand values. So for Constantine law, the brand values are clarity, modernity, value, collaboration. Now, they sound vague, but actually it's not. Clarity means how clear is your legal writing? Are you giving clear advice to clients?
Yes.
Modernity, are you coming up with ideas about how to take the business forward? Podcasts, webinars, improving the website, whatever it is. Value, are you hitting your numbers, your chargeable numbers? Collaboration, are you working effectively with other team members? And you can measure that. You can give examples about that. So collaboration sounds like a really vague, wokish concept. Actually, it's not. If you think about it, are you a closed door person? You're an open door person. What are your peers saying about you? Can you give examples about collaboration? So we have a quarterly review system and an annual appraisal based on a one-page document which has these 4 values. And I would suggest to people who may not have standalone HR people, or if they do perhaps only have one, that use the appraisal system with a view to reinforcing your brand and what your business stands for.
Now,
Go on, you
Sorry.
go. And I've got one very important point to make at the end.
Okay. Well, what I was going to say, John, and actually this is more in your field now. I mean, I think one thing we haven't touched on is how vital having a performance conversation
Yes.
is from an employment law perspective, right?
Well, you read my mind, and I was going to say the floor is now mine. Look, the changes in the last week in the Employment Rights Bill mean that appraisals, whatever one thinks about appraisals, it is going to be absolutely essential that they are taking place moving forward, because 2026 will be the year of the appraisal and the year of performance management. And the reason for that is twofold. Government has struck a deal with the unions that the qualifying limit for unfair dismissal will not be from day one, but it's 6 months. But that means that basically you're going to have to evidence someone, if you want to get rid of someone for performance grounds, it's not redundancy. You're going to have to evidence and have something on the system that says, I need to get rid of John or Amanda because they're not very good. And you're probably going to have conducted a review after 3 or 4 months, and again after 6 months, to be able to evidence that. So that is going to be absolutely key. You can't wait for 18, 21 months as you do now. You're going to have to start thinking about performance considerations and objective performance considerations from day one. And the second reason, and this is in particular in the city and in high earning organizations, the removal of the cap.
Yeah.
And the removal of the cap is going to smash through the 118,000 cap that currently exists. And some people it's not just going to be in relation to salary, but the removal of the cap may mean, okay, you can get discretionary bonuses and you can get equity share schemes and things like that. So the removal of the cap could result in unfair dismissal claims that are currently capped at 118,000 could now be 7, sometimes 8 figures if you get this wrong. And so there's no point now in saying, well, John's always been useless. He knows he's been useless. Have you got any evidence to show that John's been useless? No, we overlooked his appraisal. We haven't done the appraisal for him for 2 or 3 years. Or he knows he's useless. All right, well, can I see his last appraisal? Well, you've scored John 4 out of 5. I mean, these are, the number of times I've had conversations with clients, but he's useless. Yeah, but why have you given him 4 out of 5 then for each of the last 3 years? And now you're coming to me as your lawyer saying, I need to dismiss him.
Yeah.
And if you do that in the past, you could do that and you could unfairly dismiss John, and you would know that you'd have to pay his notice a maximum £118,000. Now, John's going to have a claim for uncapped earnings for unfair dismissal.
Yeah.
And that means that you're going to have to give him honest, consistent feedback. It's no longer going to be optional, or appraisals are going to be nice to have, because the effects of the new Employment Rights Bill, if it passes through Parliament, there's a lot of stories that it may get through before Christmas. This stuff is going to come into effect next year, which is going to mean that appraisals and performance management are going to be absolutely front and central for UK PLC from the beginning of 2026 onwards.
Yeah, 100%. This is great. And I think, quite often I've found in the past that we go back to the bonus documentation when there is in the performance documentation when there is a bonus dispute or a promotion dispute. We always go back to, okay, what was said in the appraisal over the last years? So that's why the documentation is so important.
Yeah.
So I think one thing we could probably summarize, John, just in terms of kind of wrapping up, I'm thinking about, what is the best way to proceed in a small company and a larger company. And I think it is this shift from assessment only or judgment to development. And, there's a number of research pieces about this. Now, you've heard about the KISS phenomenon, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, that sounds a bit mean, but what it means is having...
I thought you were offering something else there, Amanda, but
It is that time of year.
we're quite remotely based, and this is a public podcast, but anyway.
Yes, and we're legal professionals and in HR, but keeping
Let's
clear.
take it offline.
We haven't been drinking, honestly. Keep it clear, simple goals, basically. Looking at skills and behaviors, not just outcomes alone, and then having those more frequent, lighter touch points, check-ins, and then really giving strengths-based feedback as opposed to big gaping areas that you're seeing. Really try to focus on the strengths. And I think that really improves motivation without sacrificing standards, in my view. And then the last thing, which really plays to the point you've just mentioned with the bill coming in, is manager capability. It is the single biggest predictor of success of a performance conversation, and Gallup have shown that in their report this year.
Thank you very much. We end with a kiss, which all good podcasts should do. But look, this is quite a serious subject. It's a relevant subject because it's happening at this time of the year, and it will become ever more relevant in 2026 because of employment law changes that are afoot. So look, I wish you a very, very happy Christmas. I wish our listeners a happy Christmas. Thank you for listening to us. We're going to do a podcast a month throughout 2026. And if you, the listener or the viewer, have got suggestions about how to conduct appraisals better, please engage with us, please message us, and we'll take those forward. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.